December 25th, early morning, Caribbean Sea. At 6:39 local time, 5 Venezuelan Navy vessels changed course almost simultaneously. It was not a slow drift, and it did not look accidental. Each ship left its original patrol line and began moving toward the USS George Washington, which was operating in international waters. On the radar screen, the change was instant and impossible to miss. 5 contacts changing course, the radar operator reported. All are now converging. Coordinated movement. These were not fishing boats or small patrol craft wandering off route. Their profiles matched Venezuelan naval vessels, equipped, organized, and moving with clear purpose. Within minutes, they increased speed from a routine cruising pace to a steady intercept speed. Not full power, not reckless, just fast enough to close the gap while avoiding the appearance of an immediate emergency. That detail mattered. It suggested pressure, not chaos. The U.S. ship issued a bridge-to-bridge call. Venezuelan naval vessels. This is a United States Navy ship operating in international waters. State your intentions. No answer. The message was repeated in Spanish. Still nothing. Instead, the Venezuelan vessels changed formation. 2 shifted left, 1 stayed in the center, and 2 moved wide to the right. It was a classic surface pressure pattern, spreading the picture and forcing the carrier group to track several angles at once. Then came the next move. At 6:45, the lead Venezuelan vessel crossed the carrier's projected path. It was not close enough to create immediate contact, but close enough to force careful calculations. Its bow passed less than 9 nautical miles ahead, sending a clear message without a single word. The space in front of the carrier was now being challenged. The other 4 vessels adjusted with it. At that point, the pattern became obvious. They were not forming a circle around the carrier. They were creating a moving barrier. Inside the Combat Information Center, the mood changed. Not emotionally, but procedurally. Closest point of approach decreasing, one tracker called out. Multiple contacts, CPA under 7 nautical miles. Electronic warfare teams confirmed that 2 of the Venezuelan vessels were using active surface search radar. Low power, not targeting grade, but intentional. They were scanning the carrier and its escorts, measuring distance, movement, and response. Still, there was no radio reply. On the flight deck, everything appeared calm. Aircraft remained secured. Deck crews continued routine checks. There was no visible display meant to provoke a reaction. That restraint was deliberate. Below deck, however, the carrier and its escorts were already adjusting. Sensors shifted priority. Every movement was recorded, time-stamped, and logged. Every course change by the Venezuelan vessels was captured by multiple systems: shipboard radar, optical sensors, and airborne surveillance platforms. At 6:49, one Venezuelan vessel accelerated again, reaching 22 knots. It tightened its angle of approach, pushing the closest point of approach toward 5 nautical miles. Close enough to be considered unsafe. Close enough to raise the stakes if the U.S. side chose to respond sharply. But that did not appear to be the goal. The goal was pressure. They wanted the carrier to turn. They wanted hesitation. They wanted a visible reaction that could later be presented as either a retreat or a provocation. And they were doing it without saying a word. 5 naval vessels. No announcement, no explanation. Just steel hulls changing direction, narrowing distance, and forcing every move to be calculated. By 6:50, all 5 Venezuelan ships had completed the maneuver. They were positioned ahead of the carrier's path and slightly off to the side, staggered, offset, and moving in sync. They were not blocking the carrier outright. They were not making direct contact. But they had made one thing clear. Every mile forward would now be contested. That was the moment their intent became impossible to ignore. This was not a simple encounter. It was a carefully measured challenge. And from that moment on, every decision mattered. A calm response could keep it contained. A sharp one could turn the situation into something much more serious. When the Venezuelan naval vessels finished their maneuver, the U.S. Navy did not respond with speed, noise, or visible pressure. There was no sudden turn, no burst of acceleration, and no argument over the radio. USS George Washington held its course. That choice was not weakness, it was strategy. Inside the Combat Information Center, the situation was upgraded. This was no longer being treated as routine surface traffic. It was now understood as a coordinated pressure move by a foreign navy. The response changed immediately, but not emotionally. It changed by procedure. Maintain current heading, the captain ordered. Full documentation, no deviation unless required for safety. Those words carried weight. If a carrier changes course under pressure, it can send the wrong message. So the carrier stayed steady. Instead, the escort ships began to reposition. 2 U.S. destroyers adjusted quietly, widening their spacing and moving into offset screening positions. From a distance, it did not look dramatic, but tactically, it was exact. From above, the formation now looked like a layered arc. The carrier in the center, escorts covering the approach lanes. The Venezuelan vessels noticed. They did not immediately change speed, but their radar pattern shifted. Their emissions became intermittent. Short bursts, then silence. It looked like surface search probing, an attempt to read how the U.S. escorts were reacting without fully committing to a more direct posture. Every signal was recorded. Electronic warfare teams logged the frequency, duration, and sweep pattern of each pulse. There was no interference, no visible counteraction, and no dramatic response. The U.S. side simply listened, measured, and documented. That was the advantage. Patience supported by sensors. At 7:01, a third bridge-to-bridge message was sent. The voice was calm and controlled. Venezuelan naval vessels, you are maneuvering unsafely in international waters. State your intentions. Again, there was no reply. Then the center Venezuelan vessel made a small course correction. 3 degrees to starboard. It was subtle, but it tightened the spacing with the nearest U.S. escort. Not enough to create a legal breaking point, but enough to matter tactically. The next response came from above. Flight operations were cleared quietly. No alarm, no dramatic announcement across the deck. Just green lights, hand signals, and practiced movement. Within minutes, a U.S. Navy Seahawk helicopter lifted from the deck and climbed low over the water. It did not rush toward the Venezuelan formation, it moved deliberately. At 200 feet, the helicopter leveled out and took position near the lead Venezuelan vessel, close enough to be clearly seen, far enough to remain controlled and professional. Its sensors were active. Optical systems, infrared cameras, and recording equipment were all focused on the scene. No show of force, no dramatic gesture, just observation. But the helicopter changed everything. Surface ships can act as if they do not see each other. Aircraft make that impossible. Through the Seahawk's forward camera, activity on the Venezuelan deck became clear. Sailors moved toward the bridge wings. One officer lifted binoculars. Another looked upward, shielding his eyes from the light. They knew they were being watched. At 7:06, the helicopter transmitted a message. Venezuelan naval vessel. This is a United States Navy aircraft. You are operating in a manner inconsistent with safe navigation. Your actions are being recorded. The message was repeated in Spanish. This time, there was a reaction. The lead Venezuelan vessel reduced speed by 2 knots. It was not a full withdrawal, but it was no longer the same confident posture. Behind it, the other 4 vessels hesitated. Their spacing widened slightly. The formation began to lose its tight shape. The changes were small, but they mattered. On the carrier, nothing changed. No course correction, no speed change, no visible reaction meant for display. That was the point. The U.S. Navy was not answering the maneuver with another maneuver. It was recording the entire event. At 7:09, the first Venezuelan radio transmission finally came through. It was not an apology. It was not an open warning. It was a formal statement. United States naval vessel, we are conducting sovereign patrol operations in proximity to Venezuelan waters. The reply came immediately. This is a United States Navy ship operating in international waters. Your movements are unsafe and are being logged. There was no debate after that. The Seahawk remained on station, orbiting wide and steady. Its cameras captured every course change, every movement on deck, every shift in speed. The footage was time-stamped, geolocated, and clear. At 7:14, the Venezuelan vessels began to move off-axis. One by one, their bows turned away from the carrier's projected track. Their speed dropped in small steps, 20 knots, then 19, then 18. The moving barrier began to dissolve. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly. By the time the Seahawk turned back toward the carrier, the Venezuelan formation had lost cohesion. The ships were still there. They were still watching. They were still part of the situation. But they were no longer controlling the space ahead. And that was the message. No munitions were launched. No warning rounds were used. No direct confrontation was needed. Only discipline, documentation, and a naval system built to absorb pressure without losing focus. Because in modern encounters at sea, the side that acts first often loses control of the narrative, and the U.S. Navy did not give up control of the narrative. By the time the Venezuelan vessels eased away from their intercept line, the most critical phase had already begun. When maneuvering ends, interpretation begins. The carrier strike group did not relax. In fact, its posture became tighter, not in a visible way, but internally. The event was now being treated as an active gray zone confrontation. No engagement had taken place, no boundary had been crossed, but intent had been shown, recorded, and recognized by both sides. Aboard USS George Washington, the Combat Information Center shifted from real-time response to detailed analysis. What had just happened was not random. Analysts replayed the previous 30 minutes step by step. Course changes, speed adjustments, formation spacing, radar activity. Every Venezuelan move followed a recognizable pattern. Apply pressure, avoid crossing the clearest red lines, force a decision, and do it without triggering open escalation. This did not look like a local commander improvising in the moment. It looked like doctrine. The Venezuelan Navy's goal was not to hold the carrier in place forever. That would have invited a much firmer response. Their objective was simpler and far more political. Create an image that could be used later. A carrier challenged, a superpower tested, a moment they could shape into a message. But that only works when the other side gives you something useful. And the U.S. Navy had given them nothing. At 7:21, the carrier strike group began the next phase. Not through dramatic movement, but through messaging. The escort ships adjusted their spacing again, subtly narrowing the approach lanes the Venezuelan vessels would need if they tried to close in once more. It was not a blockade. It was a reminder. At the same time, airborne surveillance remained overhead, rotating quietly to keep uninterrupted coverage of the entire area. The Venezuelan crews noticed. They had expected a reaction. What they got instead was endurance. Minutes passed, then 10, then 20. No sudden American maneuver, no withdrawal, no escalation. That silence carried weight. On the Venezuelan side, hesitation began to show. One vessel briefly broke formation to reposition. Another started to fall behind. Their alignment was no longer as clean as before. Whatever coordination had defined the opening move was now starting to weaken under constant observation. At 7:34, a second Venezuelan radio message came through. It was short and carefully worded. United States naval vessel, we advise you to alter course to avoid unsafe proximity. It was not an order. It was not supported by a new maneuver. It was a statement designed to sound firm without forcing the issue. The carrier's reply was immediate and controlled. Your advisory is noted. We are operating in accordance with international law. Maintain safe distance. Nothing more followed. No debate, no extended explanation, no justification, none was needed. From that point forward, the balance had shifted. The Venezuelan vessels were no longer applying pressure. They were managing appearances. The question was no longer how to challenge the carrier. It was how to disengage without looking like they had backed away. At 7:41, the outermost Venezuelan vessel changed course 10 degrees away from the carrier's projected path. It was a small adjustment, but it was the first clear sign of disengagement. 2 minutes later, another vessel followed. Speeds dropped again. The moving barrier was gone. What remained was distance without leverage. For the next half hour, the Venezuelan vessels stayed in the area, shadowing from a range that could no longer be described as unsafe. The Seahawk helicopter made one final wide pass, high, slow, and unmistakable, before returning to the carrier. Every second was recorded. By 8:10, the situation was effectively over. There was no announcement, no dramatic signal, no single headline moment, just 5 naval vessels easing back toward their patrol lines, their moment already spent. On board the carrier, watch rotations continued as scheduled. Breakfast was served. Aircraft maintenance resumed. From the flight deck, it looked like an ordinary morning at sea. But below decks, the assessment was already clear. The Venezuelan Navy had gained visibility but lost initiative. They had tested a carrier strike group and found not overreaction, but steadiness. Not intimidation, but documentation. Not panic, but control. And that distinction matters. In modern naval confrontations, success is not always measured by who acts first. It is measured by who forces the other side to explain themselves afterward. And when this encounter reached briefing rooms and diplomatic channels, the record would be clear. Time-stamped, geolocated, and documented by multiple platforms. 5 Venezuelan naval vessels maneuvered in a challenging pattern in international waters. A U.S. carrier held course. Pressure was applied. Pressure failed. No engagement occurred, no escalation could be claimed, no narrative was surrendered. This was not restraint born from weakness, it was restraint used as leverage. Because in a gray zone confrontation, one of the most costly mistakes is losing control of the sequence. And on that December morning in the Caribbean, the sequence never left American hands. By mid-morning, the standoff was technically finished. Strategically, however, it had only just begun. The 5 Venezuelan naval vessels had moved away from the carrier's path, but they had not fully left the area. They stayed at extended range, keeping visual contact and adjusting course just enough to avoid being officially described as unsafe. That hesitation said more than any radio message could. If their goal had been direct confrontation, they would have pushed harder. If their goal had been firm deterrence, they would have held position. Instead, they remained somewhere in between, watching, waiting, and recalculating. On board the carrier strike group, the assessment was already clear. The Venezuelan maneuver had failed to force a reaction, and without a reaction, the entire pressure campaign lost its purpose. Gray zone tactics depend on uncertainty. They work only when the other side fills in the gaps for you. The U.S. Navy did not. As the hours passed, the situation moved from tactical to psychological. The Venezuelan ships were now the ones exposed. Their earlier movements had been recorded from multiple angles: shipboard sensors, aircraft, and external intelligence platforms. Every turn, every speed change, every unanswered radio call was now part of a permanent record. That record mattered more than any dramatic response at sea. Because in modern maritime confrontations, the real contest often continues long after the ships separate. It moves into press briefings, diplomatic channels, and international discussions, where the narrative becomes its own form of leverage. And the Venezuelan commanders understood that. Shortly after 11 o'clock local time, a quiet but decisive shift took place. The lead Venezuelan vessel turned away completely, committing to a new heading back toward its coastal patrol zone. It was not slow. It was not theatrical. It was simply clear enough to remove any doubt. Within the next 20 minutes, the remaining 4 vessels followed one by one. No tight formation, no coordinated departure, just separation. The message was unmistakable. The moment had passed. From the American perspective, there was nothing to celebrate. This was not a victory display. It was confirmation that the right response had been chosen. No direct engagement meant no justification was needed. No forced maneuver meant no unwanted precedent had been created. The carrier strike group continued its transit exactly as planned. Later that afternoon, internal reports were completed. Sensor data was compiled. Visual footage was archived. Communication logs were secured. Nothing had to be rushed. Nothing had to be explained away. The record spoke for itself. What Venezuela attempted was not unusual. Smaller navies have often used proximity and posture to signal defiance against larger forces. The script is familiar. Move close, avoid the clearest red lines, and hope the other side reacts. But that script only works if the opponent accepts the role. This time, they did not. Instead of stepping back or overreacting, the carrier strike group absorbed the pressure and turned it into exposure. The longer the Venezuelan ships stayed nearby, the more data they gave away. The more they adjusted course, the clearer their intent became. Pressure, when it produces no result, begins to turn back on the side applying it. By nightfall, the Caribbean had returned to silence. The Venezuelan vessels were no longer visible on radar. The flight deck lights reflected softly across the dark water. Watches rotated. Logs were closed. For most of the crew, the day ended like any other day at sea. But strategically, something had changed. The Venezuelan Navy had tested the boundaries and learned where they truly stood. Not at the edge of American patience, but at the limit of their own leverage. They had shown presence. They had failed to show control. And in naval confrontations, that difference is everything. Because the true outcome of a standoff is not decided by who arrives first or who leaves last. It is decided by who controls the conditions under which both happen. On that December day, no weapons were used, no ships made contact, and no warning action pushed the situation further. Yet one side left with its options intact, while the other left with explanations to prepare. That is how modern naval power often makes itself felt. Not through noise, not through sudden movement, but through the ability to let pressure collapse under its own weight. By the next morning, the Caribbean looked exactly as it had before the encounter began. Open water, clear skies. Nothing on the surface suggested that 5 naval vessels had tried and failed to influence the movement of a U.S. aircraft carrier. That is how moments like this often end, quietly. But quiet does not mean insignificant. Aboard USS George Washington, the encounter was already shifting from an operation into a case study. Not because something dramatic had happened, but because something dramatic had been avoided. No course change, no warning action, no escalation. And that result was not accidental. In the hours after the Venezuelan vessels moved away, senior officers reviewed the sequence one final time. The conclusion was the same at every level of command. The situation never required force because force had never been the real objective. This had been a test of resolve. Venezuela had attempted to compress space, create tension, and draw out a reaction that could later be used politically, either at home or abroad. They relied on proximity, uncertainty, and the assumption that a carrier under pressure would eventually show discomfort. Instead, they ran into something much harder to challenge: predictability. The U.S. Navy did exactly what it consistently says it will do in international waters: maintain course, follow established procedures, and document everything. That consistency denied Venezuela the one thing it needed most: a moment. A moment that could be framed as pressure working. A moment that could be presented as retreat. A moment that could be turned into a political message. Without that moment, the maneuver lost its value. And that is the difficult truth of modern naval standoffs. They are not won by intimidation alone. They are won by control. Control of movement. control of escalation, control of the narrative that comes afterward. By refusing to turn a tactical encounter into a spectacle, the Carrier Strike Group preserved its strategic freedom. There was no dramatic statement to defend, no accusation to untangle, no justification to provide. There was only a clean record showing who applied pressure and who did not. That record matters because these encounters do not happen in isolation. They build over time. They shape future decisions, future patrols, and future calculations on both sides. Every Navy involved learned something. On that December morning, Venezuela learned that proximity alone is not leverage. Approaching a carrier does not automatically force a response. It invites scrutiny, and restraint, when backed by overwhelming capability, is not weakness. It is control. For the U.S. Navy, the lesson was just as clear. Gray zone confrontations will continue. Smaller navies will test boundaries. Political pressure will spill into open water. And not every challenge will arrive with dramatic signals or obvious warnings. Some will come quietly. 5 ships changing course at the same time. And the answer will remain the same. Hold the line. Record the facts. Let the pressure reveal itself. Because the most dangerous mistake in these situations is reacting emotionally to a moment designed to provoke emotion. That mistake was avoided. As the carrier continued its transit, watch teams rotated. Deck crews prepared for the next cycle of flight operations. The sea returned to being just sea again. But somewhere far from the water, briefing slides were being prepared, questions were being asked, and one realization was becoming difficult to ignore. The carrier had never truly been surrounded. It had been watched, measured, and challenged. And the challenge had failed. So the next time 5 naval vessels consider closing distance, the memory of this encounter will remain. Not because of what happened, but because of what did not. No sudden mistake, no uncontrolled confrontation, no headline-making error, just a quiet reminder added to the calculation of naval power. You can approach a carrier, you can test its patience, but you cannot force it to blink.